Right now, somewhere in the world, a surgeon is cutting into a chest. A pilot is losing altitude. A lawyer is about to walk into a courtroom with her entire career on the line. A soldier is making a decision in the dark that will determine who goes home. And somewhere, far more quietly, you are sitting in a parking lot outside a meeting you are terrified to walk into. Same biology, same brain chemistry, same invisible war happening between your ears. The difference between the people who hold it together and the people who fall apart in those moments is not talent, it is not experience, it is not even courage. It is something far more specific, far more learnable, and far more hidden than anyone ever told you. And that is exactly what this is going to show you. Here is what most people get completely wrong about pressure. They think the goal is to eliminate it, to calm down, to think calm thoughts and breathe through it, and somehow trick their body into feeling nothing. 90% of people, when asked how to handle pre-performance anxiety, say the exact same thing: try to calm down. 90%. And 90% are wrong. That is not a metaphor. That is a finding from a peer-reviewed study published in the Journal of Experimental Psychology by Dr. Alison Wood Brooks at Harvard Business School in 2014. She ran a series of experiments on public speaking, karaoke singing, and math performance. And what she found flipped conventional wisdom completely on its head. The people who performed best were not the ones who tried to calm themselves. They were the ones who said 2 words out loud before they began. I am excited. That is it. 2 words. And they consistently performed better, felt more capable, and were rated as more competent by outside observers. Why? Because your brain does not separate anxiety from excitement as cleanly as you think it does. Both are high arousal states. Both flood your system with the same chemicals, raise your heart rate the same way, narrow your focus the same way. The only difference is the story you attach to those sensations. And the story you tell yourself about what is happening in your body determines whether those same chemicals become fuel or poison. That is the first thread. Pull it, and everything starts to unravel in a fascinating direction. If you have ever watched yourself shrink in a high-stakes moment, lost words mid-sentence, gone completely blank on something you knew perfectly well 10 minutes before, or made a decision under pressure that felt like someone else made it, this is for you. Because what happened in those moments was not weakness. It was neuroscience. And once you understand the mechanism, you can finally do something about it. By the time you finish this, you will understand what pressure literally does to your brain at the structural level. Why the people the world considers unshakable are unshakable. What separates someone who chokes from someone who performs. What manipulation experts know about pressure that most people never figure out. And the exact psychological tools that elite soldiers, surgeons, athletes, and crisis negotiators use to stay sharp when everything around them is on fire. And if you find this useful, do yourself a favor. Save it. Because this is exactly the kind of material you will want to come back to the morning before something hard. Now, let us start with what is actually happening inside you. Your brain has a security system. It is ancient, it is fast, and it was designed for a world where the most pressing danger was a predator in tall grass. The moment it detects a threat, real or imagined, it fires. The eyes or ears send a signal to a structure called the amygdala, a small almond-shaped cluster deep in the brain that processes fear and emotional urgency. The amygdala does not wait for a board meeting agenda. It does not care about your promotion. It interprets that interview, that confrontation, that presentation, that difficult conversation, the exact same way your ancestors' brain interpreted a charging lion. As a survival emergency, that lever triggers the hypothalamus, which acts as your brain's command center. It sends signals through the nervous system to the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys. Within seconds, Adrenaline floods your bloodstream. Your heart pounds. Your breathing shallows and quickens. Your muscles tense. Blood gets rerouted away from your digestive system and toward your limbs. Your pupils dilate. You are, physiologically, ready to run or fight. This is the fight-or-flight response. And here's the thing nobody tells you about it. It was never designed for complexity. It was designed for one decision: run or stay. But the threats you face today are not lions. They are nuanced. They require judgment. They require language, logic, creativity, strategic thinking, the ability to read another person's facial expression and respond in real time. All of that lives in a different part of your brain entirely: the prefrontal cortex, the slow, deliberate, executive control center that makes you human. And this is where pressure becomes genuinely dangerous, because high levels of stress hormones, specifically cortisol and norepinephrine, begin to chemically suppress your prefrontal cortex. Dr. Amy Arnsten at Yale School of Medicine spent years documenting this exact mechanism. Her research showed that under sustained stress, the synaptic connections within the prefrontal cortex's pyramidal neurons, the architecture responsible for working memory, impulse control, and rational decision-making, begin to physically weaken. The dendritic spines, the tiny connectors between neurons, actually retract. Meanwhile, the exact opposite happens to the amygdala. It grows stronger, more reactive, more dominant. Read that again. The part of your brain that thinks clearly shrinks. The part that panics expands. This is not a temporary mood. This is a structural change in how your brain allocates its resources in the moment of pressure. And it explains something you have probably noticed without being able to name it. The phenomenon researchers call choking. Choking under pressure is not laziness. It is not a character flaw. It is what happens when the wrong brain region takes over. Research published in Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience describes 3 primary theories of why people choke. The distraction account, where high stakes flood your attention with irrelevant information. The explicit monitoring account, where you suddenly start overthinking skills that were automatic, like thinking too hard about your own handshake or where to put your hands during a speech. And the over-arousal account, where the sheer volume of cortisol in your system exceeds the threshold your prefrontal cortex can handle. Matthew Emmons was one shot away from an Olympic gold medal in Beijing in 2004. He stepped up. He fired. It was a bullseye. Wrong target. He shot at the wrong target in one of the highest pressure moments of his life. Something so unlikely it barely seems possible. That is choking. That is what happens when the brain in your chest takes over from the brain in your skull. And you need to understand something uncomfortable. The people most at risk are not the weakest performers. According to Dr. Sidney Ceruto, a neuroscientist who spent 26 years working with high-functioning adults, the people whose prefrontal function collapses most completely under sustained stress are often the ones carrying the most. The ones managing complex decisions, competing demands, sustained pressure, not because they are less capable, but because they have been running at high output long enough that cortisol has done quiet structural damage to the one brain region responsible for the decisions that define their lives. Here is the good news. The brain is plastic. It rewires. And what the research shows is that the same mechanisms that make it vulnerable can be consciously worked with. But that takes understanding something that almost nobody talks about when they discuss pressure. It is called the Yerkes-Dodson law, discovered in 1908 by psychologists Robert Yerkes and John Dodson in what was, incidentally, an experiment on Japanese dancing mice. It describes the relationship between arousal and performance as an inverted U-shape. On the left end of the curve, low arousal, boredom, disengagement, flat performance. On the right end, extreme arousal, panic, cognitive collapse, also flat performance. At the peak, moderate arousal, and that is where all the magic lives. The problem is, most people operating under chronic pressure are spending most of their time on the far right of that curve, in the frazzle zone, running hot all the time. And the cruel irony is that the modern world is engineered to keep you there. Constant notifications, open plan offices, looming deadlines stacked on top of each other, 12-hour workdays dressed up as productivity. We have built environments that maximize arousal and then act confused when creative output suffers. Here is a statistic that should genuinely alarm you. According to Gallup's 2024 Global Workplace Report, 41% of employees globally report experiencing a lot of stress daily. Eagle Hill Consulting's November 2025 survey found that 55% of the U.S. workforce is currently experiencing burnout, a 6-year high. Job stress costs the U.S. economy more than $300 billion a year in absenteeism, turnover, productivity loss, and medical costs. And chronic job stress contributes to approximately 120,000 deaths per year in the United States, primarily from cardiovascular disease. 120,000 people every year. Not from the stress of being chased by predators, from email, from quarterly reviews, from the relentless low-grade pressure of modern working life. And here is what almost no stress management content will tell you. That pressure is not the enemy. The relationship between you and the pressure is. Researchers at Stanford found that people who believed stress was harmful had a 33% higher risk of dying from a stress-related illness than people who were equally stressed but did not view stress as harmful. The physical impact of stress was almost entirely mediated by the belief about it. Same cortisol, same heart rate, same difficult circumstances, different story about what it meant, completely different health outcomes. Research with Navy SEALs trainees reinforced this with military precision. Candidates who reported what researchers call a stress-is-enhancing mindset, people who genuinely believed stress was beneficial, persisted 12% longer during training, finished obstacle courses 4.2% faster, and received 60% fewer negative evaluations from their peers. Not because they were less stressed, because they had reframed what the stress meant. This is not positive thinking. This is not telling yourself it will all be fine. This is something neurologically sharper than that, and it connects directly to the concept of stress inoculation. In the early 1970s, Canadian psychologist Donald Meichenbaum developed a structured intervention called stress inoculation training, or SIT. The name is intentional. It works exactly like a vaccine. A vaccine does not give you immunity by keeping you away from a pathogen. It gives you immunity by exposing you to a manageable version of it over and over until your system learns to handle it without catastrophizing. Meichenbaum's framework does the same thing for psychological pressure. SIT runs in 3 phases. The first is conceptualization, where you develop an honest understanding of your stress, what triggers it, how you respond, what the actual stakes are. The second is skill acquisition, where you build a specific toolkit of coping responses, breathing regulation, cognitive restructuring, attention control, self-talk strategies. The third is application and follow-through, where you practice those skills in increasingly realistic, high-pressure rehearsals until using them becomes as automatic as the panic response used to be. This is not theoretical. The U.S. Army's Center for Enhanced Performance has been implementing versions of this training for soldiers at all levels. The Norwegian Special Operation Forces used a bespoke performance psychology package, developed and evaluated in a 2025 study published through Norsof, which found that mental skills training had measurable positive effects on already elite performers, both during preparation and post-deployment. The UK military, emergency physicians, Olympic athletes, firefighters, crisis negotiators. The data consistently shows that the ability to perform under extreme pressure is trainable. But the training looks almost nothing like what you would expect. Because here is the thing about Navy SEALs training. The attrition rate for BUD CS, Basic Underwater Demolition and SEAL Training, runs between 70 and 85% for first-time candidates. Researchers who studied this closely noted that BUD CS is more a test of mental toughness than physicality. Students believe they are prepared until they encounter the reality of Phase 1. The most brutal week, called Hell Week, involves 5.5 days of mere continuous activity on approximately 45 minutes of sleep total. The candidates who drop are not always the physically weakest. Sometimes the most physically gifted candidates quit, while smaller, physically unremarkable candidates complete it. What separates them? Intentional compartmentalization. The SEALs call it segmentation. You are not running for 5 days. You are running to the next meal. You are not surviving a week. You are surviving the next 2 hours. The brain, faced with the whole elephant, freezes. Faced with one small bite, it keeps moving. This is not a motivational poster. This is a cognitive load management strategy that reduces the amygdala's perceived threat level while keeping the prefrontal cortex online enough to function. And this brings us to something that connects the world of elite performance to something you likely encounter every single week without recognizing it: pressure as a weapon. Every sophisticated manipulation tactic, whether it comes from a skilled negotiator, a con artist, a bad faith employer, an abusive partner, or a social engineering attack, has one goal: to get you off the right side of that inverted U-curve and onto the far right, to flood your amygdala and suppress your prefrontal cortex so that your slow, deliberate, rational brain goes offline and your fast, reactive, rule-of-thumb brain takes over. According to a 2025 Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, around 60% of data breaches involve the human element, achieved through phishing, credential theft, or direct manipulation. Attackers use emotional triggers in the vast majority of cases, specifically to bypass critical thinking. And those emotional triggers are not random. They are precise. They target specific psychological levers that every human brain carries. Authority. The brain is wired to comply with perceived hierarchy, especially under time pressure. An email that appears to come from your CEO, a phone call from someone claiming to be law enforcement, a manager's urgent request delivered with the right tone of certainty. These all trigger the same ancient deference mechanism that kept our ancestors alive in tribal societies. Urgency. Creating artificial time pressure is perhaps the most effective manipulation tool that exists, because time pressure is one of the fastest ways to suppress deliberate processing and trigger automatic, instinctive responses. When someone tells you that you must decide right now, that you will lose this opportunity if you wait even 5 minutes, they are not giving you information. They are chemically altering your decision-making capacity. Fear. When an outcome feels threatening, your threat detection system expands its reach. It starts seeing danger in places where logic would find none. And that expansive anxiety makes you more susceptible to whoever appears to be offering a solution. Social proof. The classic Solomon Asch experiment showed that people would deny the obvious evidence of their own eyes when surrounded by a group claiming something different was true. When attackers claim that everyone has already complied, when they imply that your hesitation is the aberration, that they are leveraging millions of years of social evolution. Here is what researchers note specifically about manipulation and pressure. Victims react more vulnerably when they stay in automatic, subconscious processing. Suspicion, actual critical evaluation, occurs almost exclusively when people switch to conscious, deliberate processing. The only way to defend against manipulation is to slow down, to insert a pause where the manipulator is trying to eliminate one. And that pause, that deliberate interruption of the automatic sequence, is where breath comes in. Not as a metaphor, not as a wellness concept, as a neurological tool. Your autonomic nervous system has two branches. The sympathetic, which accelerates everything. Heart rate up, breathing shallow and fast, muscles tight, cortisol rising. And the parasympathetic, which decelerates, heart rate down, digestion returns, muscles soften, thinking clears. These two systems cannot be fully active simultaneously. And the vagus nerve, the long wandering nerve that connects your brainstem to your heart, lungs, and gut, is the primary channel through which you can deliberately shift between them. The exhale is the key, specifically an exhale that is longer than the inhale. When you exhale fully, you stimulate the vagus nerve, which directly activates the parasympathetic branch. Your heart rate drops, cortisol begins to clear, the prefrontal cortex gets better blood flow, you come back online. Box breathing, the technique Navy SEALs use in combat situations, is built on exactly this mechanism. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. A study in the International Journal of Psychophysiology found that this pattern reduced pre-performance anxiety by 35% in high-stress scenarios, and participants showed measurably improved cognitive performance under pressure. 35%, from a breathing pattern that takes less than 2 minutes. The 4-7-8 method, popularized by Dr. Andrew Weil but rooted in ancient pranayama practices, extends the exhale further. Inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8. A 2022 study in Physiological Reports found significant improvements in heart rate variability and reductions in systolic blood pressure after practicing this technique in healthy adults. Researchers concluded that the extended exhale phase specifically stimulates the vagus nerve in a way that activates parasympathetic recovery faster than most other interventions. These are not relaxation exercises for people who have the luxury of being relaxed. They are emergency neurological tools. The kind of thing a surgeon uses before a critical incision, a pilot uses during an unexpected system failure, and a negotiator uses when the conversation turns threatening. The moment you feel the amygdala pulling the lever, 4 seconds in, hold, 8 seconds out. That is your override button. But breath alone is not enough. Because pressure is not just a physiological event. It is a cognitive one. And the cognitive piece requires a different kind of intervention entirely. Researchers studying the phenomenon of choking identified something important about the mechanism of performance failure under high incentive. Brain regions implicated in motivation and reward, particularly the ventral striatum, become overactivated when the stakes feel extremely high. The brain essentially starts watching itself perform. It shifts attention from the task to the outcome, from the execution to the evaluation, and that shift is catastrophic for skilled performance. Think about the last time you did something incredibly well while fully absorbed in it. Not monitoring yourself, not thinking about how you looked, just doing. Athletes call it being in the zone. Psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying this state and named it flow. He described it as a condition where a person is so fully involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. Consciousness narrows to the task. Self-consciousness disappears. Time distorts. Performance reaches its peak. His research, now supported by over 2,600 peer-reviewed publications, found that flow is not luck. It is not magic. It occurs predictably when the challenge level of a task roughly matches the skill level of the person performing it. Too easy, and the mind wanders. Too hard, and anxiety dominates. Right at the edge, where it is genuinely hard but genuinely possible, that is where flow lives. And neuroscience has begun illuminating what the brain looks like during this state. One of the consistent findings involves what researchers call transient hypofrontality, a temporary reduction in activity in the parts of the prefrontal cortex associated with self-monitoring, inner criticism, and deliberate cognitive control. In flow, your inner critic goes quiet. The part of you that keeps asking how you look while you perform it retreats. And the execution system, the part that knows exactly how to do the thing you have practiced thousands of times, takes over entirely. This is why expert performance degrades when self-consciousness spikes. A professional musician who has played a piece 10,000 times will perform worse if they suddenly become acutely aware of every finger position. A basketball player who starts thinking about shooting mechanics will miss shots they make effortlessly in practice. The skill is there. The awareness of the skill is what destroys it. Cognitive reappraisal is the other essential tool, and it works on a different level entirely. Research published in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience showed that when people reappraise the meaning of an incentive before performing a high-stakes motor task, choking was significantly reduced. The reappraisal changed not just their mood, but the neural representation of the reward in the ventral striatum. The brain literally processed the high stakes differently after the cognitive reframe. Less like a threat, more like a manageable challenge. This is the science behind the practice of deliberately asking yourself different questions before a hard moment. Not what if I fail, but what if this goes well? Not why is this happening to me, but what is this preparing me for? Not how do I stop feeling nervous, but what does this nervousness tell me I care about? The reframe does not eliminate the arousal. It redirects it. And the direction of your arousal is, it turns out, nearly everything. There is something else worth naming, because it is rarely discussed in this context, and it is one of the most powerful psychological tools that exists: self-talk. Specifically, the way you use the word you versus the word I when you talk to yourself under pressure. Research by Ethan Kross, a psychologist at the University of Michigan, found that when people facing stressful situations shifted from first-person self-talk, "I am so nervous, I can't do this," to third-person or name-based self-talk, "Why is your name nervous? What does your name need to do right now?" they showed reduced anxiety, improved performance, and faster emotional recovery. The distance created by referring to yourself in the third person activates a slightly more objective, observational mode of processing. It creates a gap between you and the experience of the pressure, which is exactly the gap needed to make a deliberate choice instead of an automatic reaction. This is the same principle behind the SEAL observation that the people who perform best under pressure have learned to work with their minds rather than be ruled by them. You cannot eliminate the internal weather. You can learn to observe it without being consumed by it. And that gap between observation and reaction is where all your real choices live. There is one more layer that most people completely miss. And it might be the most counterintuitive thing in this entire script. You cannot actually perform at your best under high pressure unless you have built a relationship with pressure in low-stakes environments. There is no shortcut around this. The people who hold it together in the boardroom, in the courtroom, in the cockpit, did not discover a secret in the moment. They rehearsed for it, repeatedly, deliberately. They made their nervous system familiar with the sensation of challenge at the edge of their capacity, so that when the real version arrived, the sensation was recognizable rather than alien. This is exactly what stress inoculation training does systematically, and what the brain develops naturally through repeated experience of managing difficult things and surviving them. Every time you do something hard and come through it, you deposit something into a psychological account. Not confidence exactly, not the feeling that nothing can hurt you, but something more durable than confidence. Evidence. Evidence that you have been here before. Evidence that the pressure was real and you functioned through it. Evidence that the discomfort of high arousal is survivable. The researchers who study Navy SEAL trainees found that the candidates who complete BUD/SAS are not the ones who found Hell Week easy. They are the ones who found it unbearable and kept moving anyway. Who, when their body was telling them it was done, accessed one more hour and then another. Their secret was not that they felt less. It was that they had trained their interpretation of what feeling that way meant. This is why mental skills training for elite military forces specifically includes visualization. Not wishful thinking, deliberate sensory-specific mental rehearsal of exact scenarios, complete with the physical sensations, the emotional texture, the precise decisions required. A 1996 study found that basketball players who only visualized free throws improved their accuracy by 23%. Players who only physically practiced improved by 24%. 1% difference. The mental rehearsal was almost as effective as the physical practice. The reason is simple. The brain does not cleanly distinguish between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. The neural pathways activated are substantially overlapping, which means you can practice for the worst moment of next week right now. You can run the scenario in your mind until the sensations become familiar, until your nervous system has a reference point, until the moment arrives and some part of you says quietly, "I have been here before." Now, bring all of this together, because what you have just walked through is not a collection of disconnected tips. It is a complete architecture. And here is how it fits. The amygdala fires first. That is not a flaw. That is a feature. It kept your ancestors alive. You do not fight it. You work with it. You recognize the signal for what it is. Not evidence of danger. Evidence of significance. Evidence that something you care about is on the line. Then you breathe. 4 in. Hold. 8 out. You are not calming down. You are switching from sympathetic overdrive back to a state where your prefrontal cortex can function. You are turning the thinking brain back on. Then you talk to yourself. Not "I am calm." That is fighting the arousal, and it rarely works. "I am excited." 2 words that redirect the same chemical state toward opportunity rather than threat. If that feels too abstract, try the third-person version. What does your name need right now? What is the next single decision that needs to be made? Then you segment the task. Not the whole mountain, the next step, the next hour, the next sentence. The brain under pressure needs a target it can reach. Then you recognize the pressure for what it might be if it is externally applied. Time pressure, urgency, authority, fear. These are not reasons to act. They are signals to slow down. The more someone is trying to compress your decision window, the more carefully you need to consider what you are actually deciding. The pause is the protection. And if you want to build the whole structure before the crisis comes, you practice. You put yourself voluntarily into situations that are genuinely uncomfortable, not dangerous, but uncomfortable. Hard conversations, performances, high-stakes presentations you could have avoided, cold environments, public speaking, physical challenge. You let your nervous system learn the language of difficulty, so that when the difficult moment comes uninvited, it is not speaking a foreign language. There is something very human that happens at the end of a genuinely hard experience. Not the relief, though that is real. Something quieter. A small, private recognition. A recalibration of what you are capable of. Not a belief about the future. Not a promise to yourself. Just evidence. Evidence that you were in it, and you came through. And that evidence changes the next calculation your nervous system makes when the next hard thing arrives. The world is not going to stop pressing. The deadlines will not soften. The difficult conversations will not disappear. The moments where everything hinges on what you do in the next 30 seconds will keep arriving without warning. They always have. They always will. But here is the reframe you are allowed to take with you. The pressure you feel is not separate from your performance. It is raw material for it. Every physiological response you have under pressure, the heart rate, the narrowed focus, the heightened alertness, these are not malfunctions. They are tools, old tools, tools built over millions of years of evolution, tools calibrated for a world of physical threats. Tools that need to be consciously redirected by a mind that knows what is actually happening. The fight is not against the pressure. It was never against the pressure. The fight is always the same one. It is the fight to stay present, to stay deliberate, to choose your next action instead of being pulled into it, to be the person who pauses where everyone else reacts, to breathe where everyone else holds, to narrow the frame where everyone else sees the whole terrifying landscape. That is the psychology of high-pressure situations, not the absence of fear, the presence of skill. And the skill is built in the quiet spaces, in the moments that did not feel important, in the deliberate discomfort you chose, in the difficult conversation you had when you could have avoided it, in the meeting you spoke up in the small act of staying when everything in your body said leave. The surgeon who does not flinch learned to not flinch. The pilot who does not panic practiced for the moment they would want to. The negotiator who holds steady in the room built that steadiness in 1,000 smaller rooms before. You are already building yours. Every hard thing you have walked through has deposited something into that account. Every time you felt the amygdala pull the lever and chose to breathe instead of react, you grew something. Every time you reframed a threat as a challenge, not because it stopped feeling threatening, but because you decided to meet it differently, you added to the structure. The architecture is not finished. It never really is. But it grows every single time you choose the deliberate response over the automatic one. And the beautiful, scientifically verifiable thing is this: the more you build it, the more naturally it activates when you need it most. That is not a promise. That is a peer-reviewed finding, replicated across surgical residents, Olympic athletes, special operations soldiers, and emergency room physicians. Practiced pressure tolerance becomes real pressure tolerance. The nervous system that has rehearsed handling difficulty handles difficulty better. So before the next hard thing, 4 in, hold, 8 out, say, "I am excited." Refer to yourself by name, find the next single step, and then take it. You have been here before. Maybe not this exact version, but close enough.